Hi, everybody, and welcome to my monthly sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for January 2021. It contains 24 awesome stories I read in January, and I'm going to dive right in. My first story pick is Philia Eros Storge Agape Pragma. I hope I said that right, by R.S.A. Garcia in Clarkesworld. Now, this is a spectacularly good science fiction novella that weaves together military SF, hard-pounding action scenes, political intrigue, family drama, artificial intelligence as friend, family, and foe, and it has a deep love story at its heart. If you read Garcia's short story, The Sun from Both Sides, in 2019, you're on familiar territory here because this is a sequel/prequel to that story. The main character is Ava, who has retired from her military and political career and settled down with D, a man with his own complicated past. Then it appears that Ava's sister, the AI she bonded with at birth, is trying to kill her. And Ava is pulled back into a world and a war she thought she had left behind. It is an intricately layered, powerful story that plays out in the past and the present and is set in a unique and vividly drawn universe with a cast of fabulous characters. Give me more of this future verse, please. My next story pick is also from Clarkesworld. It's Intentionalities by M.A. Ogden. And I'm going to read a quote from the story. Sorrel never intended to confer a child to the Braxis Corporation, but Sorrel had never intended a lot of things that managed to happen with or without her say-so. End quote. Now, motherhood is at the center of this heartbreaking story by Ogden, but it's a take on motherhood that I haven't seen explored and laid out quite like this before. In this future, where companies own and trade pretty much every part of every human being's life, Sorrel has managed to get herself so deep into debt that she sees no way out, except that there is one way out: to carry a child and give it up to the corporation once it is of age. Now, I love how Ogden makes Sorrel a seemingly rather clueless and irresponsible adult who agrees to give up her child without really realizing what that will mean. She's not a bad person. She is just incapable of living a good life inside this terrifying corporate system that dominates the world. And the real tragedy is that once Sorrel does realize what she's actually going to lose, it is too late to stop the wheels from turning. This is both gutting and riveting from start to finish. My next story is Yearning by Maya Beck in Strange Horizons. In Beck's quietly powerful story, we travel back to the time of sharecroppers soon after the end of slavery in the United States. And in the small community that we visit, there is a weekly ceremony that the protagonist tells us about, and it involves a kind of deep magic as they gather around the fire that brings the whole community either backwards in time to see their origins or forward in time, actually traveling forward in time to see where their descendants will end up. In the story, they specifically guide Elder Sunday into the future, and it is a rather joyous trip as they visit his descendants, but afterward, an unwelcome visitor joins them by the fire. There's a real subtle power in this story, and I love the way that it explores how a community is trying to come to grips with the injustice and cruelty that defines their world, and yet they also find hope for the future and draw strength from the past. My next story pick is also from Strange Horizons. It's Scallop by J.L. Akagi, and this was published last year, I think in October, and it just sort of hit my timeline on Twitter, and I had to go read it. I'd missed it at the time, and it is fantastic. I'm going to start with a quote from the story. Scallops are ringed with eyes. They have hundreds of them, over 200 eyes tucked under the edge of their shells. Inside each of these eyes are mirrors like a telescope. Human eyes have retinas. Scallop eyes have mirrors. This isn't poetry, it's biology, but sometimes those are the same thing. Now, there are definite shades of body horror in this unsettling, evocative, but also tender story about a woman who suddenly starts growing eyes in the most unexpected places. However, this story is more than the kind of horror that makes you cringe. It's about transformation and identity. It's about love and about the secret parts of ourselves that we often hide from others, even those closest to us. And that line from the opening of the story, this isn't poetry, it's biology, but sometimes those are the same thing. That line echoes through the whole piece as people turn into trees, into snakes, and other things. It's a strange story that will stay with me for a very long time. My next story pick is Winter's Heart by Vanessa Fogg in Hexagon magazine. Now, Winter's Heart is a sharp and shimmery story. It's like ice and snow. It's a story about the Ice Queen, told by someone who used to live in her realm, but who left with a man, had a family with him, and is now dealing with her own conflicted emotions about her past and her present. Fogg always writes complex, compelling mothers and children, and she's a master at capturing the sweetness and wistfulness and conflicted nature of love. And that holds true here as well. This story hit me right in the feels because I know this mother, and sometimes I am this mother. My next story pick is Sailing to Byzantium by Jennifer R. Donahue in Fusion Fragment number 4. In this story, we meet Maggie and her father, and Maggie's father is building his ship. This is not an uncommon thing in the world of this story, but it means that Maggie's father is leaving. He is building his rocket ship and will never come back once he takes off. Now, this is an aching, heartbreaking story about family and grief, and ultimately about death, even if death in this case is leaving forever in a rocket ship you built in your own backyard. I found a sort of Bradbury vibe in this beautiful story, and the title, of course, is from the lovely poem by William Butler Yeats. My next story pick is Where the Stones Fly by Steve Zissou in Selene Quarterly, Volume 3, Issue 2. Now, this is a quirky and thoroughly enjoyable alternate history tale that gives the reader a new take on the history of early airplane development, with a group of workers and craftsmen who are building an airplane out of rock. Rock could fly, Pigeon Hill granite could soar. There's a real human depth and complexity to the story that also involves union organizing and the often tense rivalry between different granite quarries. I love stories that take a strange premise like this and really make it, well, soar. This story is part of a great issue of Selene Quarterly. My next story pick is The Long Tail by Aliette de Boudard in Wired. I'm going to read a quote from the story. Nanites were war weapons, and the Conch Citadel was a ship full of them. They hadn't run into variants before, not on this ship. Mutations usually didn't show up on the scans because the sensors weren't calibrated for random, unknowable varieties. But they'd heard the stories. End quote. Now, this is a space adventure where a crew is scavenging parts from an old derelict spaceship, a ship where reality and unreality are layered on top of each other, and where the threat of falling sort of under the spell of that unreality and running into the technical ghosts of the past and the threat of dangerous nanites is ever present. What makes this story even more fascinating for me is the idea of lineage memory, where members of the crew can share in each other's recollections. My next story pick is Song of the Raven and Crow, which is by Avra Margariti in Zooscape. And oh, how I love this fierce and feathery story about Rosanna, a ragdoll raven, her family of crows, and her mama, Mother Crow, the leader of their clan of avian deities and former witch familiars. Now, Rosanna is a ragdoll raven, but she tries to be happy with her crow family, but she's haunted by the truth of how she was made and the quest that her maker, a witch, created her to carry out. And when Rosanna goes looking for the witch, things come to a head. Fantastic story. My next story pick is Bast and Her Young by Tegan Moore in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. Now, I do love tales of ancient Egypt, and in this story, Moore follows Hatshepsut in the early days of her reign as she seeks to establish her claim to the throne by receiving the spirit of kingship in an ancient ritual. But the spirit that appears to her is not her father, as she expected, the old king. Instead, she is visited by an older and much different creature from Egypt's past. And this presence refuses to leave Hatshepsut alone once it has been summoned. I love how this story delves into the everyday world, lore, religion, and politics of ancient Egypt. And Moore's Hatshepsut is a powerful and really quite wonderful character. My next story pick is also from Beneath Ceaseless Skies. It's Columbina. And when I was a kid, I used to read my uncle's old comic books when I visited my grandparents' house. They kept the comic books in his old room. And one of my favorites was The Gauntlet of Fate, which is Ödeshandsken in Swedish. Now, this gauntlet is picked up by a new person in each issue, and adventures, tragedy often ensues. Columbina from Beneath Ceaseless Skies. It's by, I think I missed saying that. So the story is Columbina by Jelena Donato from Beneath Ceaseless Sky. Columbina is an excellent fantasy romance that reminds me of The Gauntlet of Fate. It's about Katerina, a young woman who is in love with a man without money, while her family wants her to marry a rich man she despises. And yeah, it really reminds me of the Gauntlet stories. Katerina finds the Columbina mask, and when she eventually slips it on, magic, dangerous magic, is triggered. And I really love that this story is told from the point of view of the mask itself, because it gives the story literally a unique perspective. My next story pick is The Badger's Digestion, or the first-hand description of Denescan beastcraft by an Auwan researcher. Quite the title. By Malka Older in Constellation magazine. In Older's dizzyingly strange and intriguing story, a scholar visits another country. It's a country where the inhabitants can join together as various types of beasts, dragons, kestrels, sea serpents, badgers, etc., that perform important tasks in society. It's a kind of cooperation and transformation that is decidedly magical. The people become a creature, each of them part of its body performing a part of its function. Now, Older's focus is not really on the way the beasts work, but how the society they are part of works. The visiting scholar notes many differences between their own home country and this new place, and notes the ways that working together as beasts affect both citizens and society. It's an intricate and utterly charming story that has a real Ursula K. Le Guin vibe in its focus on society and how different types of magic and or technology might influence the way people live together. My next story is also from Constellation magazine, and it's My Mother's Hand by Dante Luiz. Horacio is haunted by his dead mother's spirit, and it's not just that her spirit is still around to abuse him, it's that she literally controls parts of his body even after death. In order to free himself from her influence and to reconcile the past with who he is now, he must embark on an almost impossible quest. There's a very dark sense of humor woven into this gutting tale. And the scenes when Horacio finally finds his mother's grave and has to dig her up are, well, just go read the story. It's a terrific tale from this wonderful first issue of Constellation magazine. And Constellation is a quarterly speculative fiction bilingual magazine publishing stories in both Spanish and English. Writers can submit their stories in either language. My next story pick is I Will Teach You Magic by Andy C. Buchanan in Cosmos Infinities #4. Now, Buchanan is a must-read writer for me. I love their stories so much, and if you haven't read their fabulous, ghostly, strange novella, From a Shadow Grave, you should remedy that ASAP. I Will Teach You Magic is a wonderful, tender story about parenting and love. It's also a story about disability and physical pain, and about how the process of teaching a child to use magic can be a tool to help them live a better life, even when that magic might not be permitted, really, by society. And I love how this story isn't just about magic, but it interrogates how society and its institutions view and control the use of magic. It adds real depth to a moving piece of fiction. My next story pick is From Witch to Queen and God by L.D. Lewis in Mermaids Monthly. Well, holy woe, this story is amazing. It's an absolutely radical, unique take on Ursula the Sea Witch from The Little Mermaid, reimagining her as a much more powerful and complex character. Here, she is leading the overthrow of a government and a society built on the slave trade at the head of an army made up of the people she saved from drowning beneath the waves. Using her potent magic, she walks on land in the attack, but what she is attempting to do here stretches the utmost limits of her power. It's a smashingly good, hugely entertaining story from this first issue of Mermaids Monthly. My next story pick is 10 Steps to a Whole New You by Tonya Libbard in Fantasy Magazine. And this is a chilling, compelling delight. Azalee is fascinated by her charismatic new neighbor Francine right from the start, and Francine also shows an interest in Azalee. And even though Azalee has some real misgivings about Francine's strange propositions, she is also ready to try and see if Francine can really do what she says she can do. And once Azalee understands exactly what Francine is after, well, by then it's not just too late, but Azalee doesn't want to back out, even knowing the rather high price she might pay. There's a wonderful dark undertow to this whole story, and Libbard's prose is compelling as it weaves together Trinidadian folklore and horror. My next story pick is also from Fantasy Magazine. It's Things to Bring, Things to Burn, Things Best Left Behind by C.E. McGill from Fantasy Magazine. It's a wonderful, sharp take on a common fantasy trope, sacrificing a person to keep a community safe from a dangerous entity. In this case, there's a mountain that requires the sacrifices. Names show up in a magical hearth, and then that person must be sent off to be eaten by the mountain, never to be seen again. Oz has lost his mother to the mountain, and now it's his turn to walk the long way to his own death. He packs his things and heads out, thinking he knows what will happen, but as it turns out, the mountain requires something from him that is much more difficult for Oz to give than his life. I really like how this story explores the idea of sacrifice and what it means to sacrifice yourself. And I also like how it twists and turns this fantasy trope and finds new facets to it. My next story pick is The Van Etten House by Carrie Laban in the Dark. Now, in this story, it's fantastic horror. And as soon as they find the dolls in that upstairs room in the Van Etten house in the story, so many dolls all boxed up and covered in dust. I got the best kind of horror story chills and tingles. Laban's story never spells out in so many words exactly what the dolls are, if they are effigies or sacrifices, or what kind of terrible magic has been wrought with them, but there are hints and glimpses of it throughout the text. I love, actually, that the story doesn't explain it all, but allows the unsettling strangeness of the old house and its contents, and the effect all this may or may not have had on those who came to empty the house after its owner died remains mysterious and haunting. My next story pick is Your Own Undoing by P.H. Lee in Apex magazine. I'm going to read a quote from the story first. You look at me and you don't recognize me. It hurts that you don't recognize me, your own familiar that you made from a part of your own soul. But there are more important things for us to deal with right now. I push through the hurt and speak to you, saying, this is not a story that you're reading. This is actually happening, and is actually happening to you. End quote. This story kicked me right in the solar plexus. It's a story about magic and deception, and it's about how hard and painful and almost impossible it can be to break free when someone has managed to convince you not to believe in your own reality. A scholar and sorcerer once took on an apprentice, but once the apprentice had learned enough, he tricked the sorcerer and bound them in a horrific state of deprivation and punishment and pain. The sorcerer's familiar keeps trying to break through the curse to set them free, but how is that possible when the imprisoned person doesn't even believe they are a prisoner? It's a gutting, gripping story. My next story pick is All I Want for Christmas by Charles Pacer, also from Apex magazine. This was the winner in Apex's 2020 Holiday Horrors Flash Fiction Contest. The judge was Mike Allen of Mythic Delirium, and it is a perfectly crafted, gutting piece of flash. Robbie is waiting for Santa to come, but his childish anticipation is tinged with a whole lot of darkness. It's a quick read that packs a big emotional punch. My next story is Mouth and Marsh, Silver and Song by Sloane Leong in Fireside. In Leong's story, a marsh-born creature, a monster to the rest of the world, is born and grows in the mud and water. The creature is blessed, or rather cursed, with a strange power. When cut with a silver blade, the wound becomes a mouth that sings a prophecy, and that prophecy is required for a prince to become king, and so it has been for a long, long time, I guess, in the world surrounding this marsh. The creature is visited by many princes through the years, fighting some of them off, killing them, devouring them, while others manage to cut a prophecy from their body. But things change one day when a young woman comes seeking a prophecy. It's a gloriously fierce and voraciously brutal tale written in beautifully dark lyrical prose, and I love this savage take on prophecy and monsters and how we might change our fate if given the chance. My next story pick is La Camaraderie du Cirque by Dave Ring at Podcastle. This is a fierce, sharp, jagged story about love and lust and about revenge and repercussions. Paolo feels ill-treated by everyone at the circus, like no one respects him or even really wants him around. He grasps and grabs at whatever affection and love he can get, but the snickers and sneers and slights he is subjected to eventually lead to a face-off with his rival in love, or who he thinks is his rival in love. And what happens in that moment, when Paolo's temper runs over, changes his life and his understanding of who he is and what he is capable of forever. A twisted circus tale full of wonderful characters. My next story is Wolfsbane by Maria Davana Headley in Nightmare number 100. Now, this is exclusive paid content, so you won't find it online, but it's well worth it to pick up the issue. This story hits so many of my sweet spots all at once. It's a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, my favorite fairy tale, and is full of complex, forceful, difficult women, and the prose is absolutely glorious. No surprise, since it's written by the masterful Maria Davana Headley. It's a story about resistance and revolution, about magic and violence, about sourdough and what it takes to defeat the wolves that will come for you and try to devour you and yours. Since it's exclusive paid content, you can only read it if you buy the issue, like I said, or if you are a subscriber to Nightmare. But A, this story is worth paying for all by itself, and B, this issue of Nightmare is full of outstanding horror. And if you want to read some more fabulous retellings of Little Red Riding Hood, like I said, it's my favorite fairy tale, I can suggest 3 stories that are available online. One is Red by Melinda Lowe and Foreshadow. The second is Toothsome Things by Chimedum Ohegbu in Strange Horizons. And Rot Caption by Emily McCosh in Shimmer. My final story pick for this month is How to Break into a Hotel Room by Stephen Graham Jones, also from this issue of Nightmare, number 100. Stephen Graham Jones knows how to reel you into a story. He'll reel you in with a character or a situation, something that seems somewhat familiar, like something that might have happened, something you heard of, or someone who might have lived in your own town, been part of your own life. And then he takes the threads of that seemingly familiar strip of reality and twists them until the world splits apart and you've got chills crawling up your spine. Here, Javi is trying to pull off a small-time crime, getting into a hotel room and stealing whatever he can get his hands on. But right from the start, he's haunted by thoughts of an old crime, a crime he's told himself he wasn't really guilty of, but that he has been unable to shake. And when the twist in the story comes, when Javi realizes that nothing about this night or the hotel room is what he thought it was, by then it's much too late for him. And that was all 24 stories I had this month. Thanks so much for listening. And the whole thing is available at curiousfictions.com if you want to read it. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next month.